First, I just want to say I hope you and your families are safe and healthy and at home and taking care of yourself and each other's the best that you can in this circumstance. I also want to take a moment to acknowledge and recognize, of course, the frontline healthcare workers, the delivery drivers, the elected officials, those that are working so hard. Tonight, you're joining an Instagram Live launch of a speaker series called COVID Chats. This is led by the Goldfarb Center for Public Affairs at Colby College in Maine. And my name is Kimberly Flowers, and I lead the Goldfarb Center, and I will be your host for this evening's conversation. It's April 20th. More than 42,000 lives have been lost to COVID-19 in the United States. Most Americans have been under stay-at-home orders for a month. And today there were protests to reopen the economy across the nation, including in Maine. This speaker series, it was initially created to provide a platform, an opportunity for students to engage with policymakers in real time. It's an opportunity to talk about policy and government leadership and how that's working in a pandemic. Of course, Instagram Live is also a public forum. So in that, we welcome all Mainers. We welcome the Waterville community. We welcome just global citizens who care about the subject matter and want to hear from great speakers that we have lined up. And speaking of, we have Senator Susan Collins joining us on Wednesday night at 7 p.m. So you can follow the Goldfarb Center on Instagram to see the other speakers we have lined up. Next week, we are also talking to state and regional leaders who are also Colby alums, and we'll see where it goes from there. But let's talk about tonight. So tonight, now, we are here to kick it off with our first speaker. He is the first independent senator from Maine and a two-time governor of Maine, Angus King. He is a well-respected leader, especially around bipartisan issues. He sits on the Senate Intelligence Committee. He's been a champion for both strong economic growth as well as strong health care. So he's known for being independent and really working across party lines. He, of course, has been in the headlines recently, being critical about the Trump administration's response to COVID-19, especially related to testing. It is such an honor to have Senator King join us. So now is the time when I should tell all of you that are watching. This is my first time to do an Instagram Live interview, and it is his too. So everybody cross your fingers, maybe cross them twice for both of us as I have him join us. Well, we're going to work on that right now. Here we go. And it looks
Hey,
like
there we go.
Yay! You made it.
We made it. Good. Good.
It's so good to have you on here.
Oh,
It's
listen,
nice to
I'm
meet
delighted.
you over the phone.
I'm absolutely delighted to join you, and we made it work. I've now added Zoom to my repertoire, Cisco meeting, and now Instagram Live. Glad to be with you.
Right? I think I already made my first snafu and made the camera turn around for a hot second before you came on. So it's all
That's
good.
all right. I saw your ceiling there or something.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for joining us. We know how busy you are, and we really appreciate your time. So I think to start, Senator King, to start the conversation, I want to hear first just what's on your mind when you're thinking about government leadership and immediate sort of policy actions that need to happen right now to protect the health and the safety of Mainers. What are you thinking about right now?
Well, of course, what's on everybody's mind is when can we go back to work? When can we reopen the economy? And everybody wants to do that as soon as possible. The question is, how do we do it safely? And that's really the concern. And everything that I've read and studied and the experts that I've talked to tell me that the absolute basis for going back to the opening of the economy is testing. A huge amount more than what we're doing now. Are you still hearing me, seeing me?
Yeah, I can hear you and see you just great.
Okay. Well, the testing is really the issue, and that's my concern. We're now testing about 140,000 people a day. The minimum estimate for what we ought to be doing is more like 500,000, and many experts say it should be 1 million, because otherwise we're flying blind. If everybody walks out of their house today and goes to work, we know that there are going to be people carrying the virus, And the danger is starting all over again. So it's not a question of anybody wanting to keep the the economy closed. It's a question of doing it in a way that we don't generate a new spike in cases and end up even in a deeper, longer lockdown. So that's the issue. And my criticism, you mentioned headlines. My criticism is that the President Trump, the government, the federal government basically said, this is all up to the states. Well, the states can do a lot, but they can't control the national supply chain for testing. That's really a federal responsibility. The president has something called the Defense Production Act that he can use to force more production of certain areas. They have an overview of the entire supply chain. And so that's when I sort of lost my patience last week with a lot of these general reassurances, don't worry, the testing's going to be fine. Well, it isn't fine, and it's unfair to throw this decision onto the governors without giving them the tools to be able to do it safely. So that's the main issue that I think we've got to address right now.
Sure. There's a lot of topics that I want to try to cover with you in a very short time. I'm interested in hearing more about the tension between federal and state authorities in relationship, racial inequalities, the global perspective. But I think in light of the protests that happened today outside of the governor's house where you used to sit, and you just spoke a lot to the issue about reopening the economy, but talk a little bit more about, what would you say to someone who was out there protesting today, who has lost their livelihood and just wants to go back to work? What can you say to them to reassure them about the economy and how we're going to come out of this?
Well, I think the first thing to say is that there is an enormous amount of assistance coming from Washington in the way of enhanced unemployment benefits, benefits for small businesses, benefits for larger businesses, payments to individuals. All of those are designed to help us get through this. And there's more on the way. There's negotiations going on literally as we're talking here tonight to try to finalize another outpouring of support for small businesses, for hospitals, for testing, and for all of those kinds of things. So there's a lot of support going, but I understand how hard this is. I walk down Main Street in Brunswick and it breaks my heart to see stores closed that I've been trading with for 30 years. Yeah. But we're fighting something we've never had to deal with before, and it's a highly contagious, highly dangerous virus that spreads from person to person. Until we have a vaccine or a cure, both of which are months, maybe as much as a year away, the only way to stop the spread of it is to stay away from one another. And that's just the fact. And if we don't do that, if we say, well, we want to go back, and it starts to spike up, and we go from 700 or 800 cases in Maine to 1,000 or 2,000 or 3,000, and people are dying, we'll be back in a lockdown, only it'll be worse and longer. So this is a kind of thing where we have to really do the best we can for the next month or more, and then the governor's going to make that decision based upon the situation at the time. But we can't do it unless we have much broader testing than we have now. If we can do that, that's what all the experts say, that's what's worked in other countries. That's what we have to really build up in a very short period of time.
Tell us a little bit more about, you said the money is coming. We know a lot has been happening in Washington, especially the last few days. Talk about those negotiations. You've been known for being, as an independent, being bipartisan and working across different party lines. So talk about how you've been using the skills that you've had from years of experience, especially your leadership as well, in terms of like the government shutdown. So what's been happening in Washington, and what's the next steps?
Well, what's been happening, it sort of goes out 8 or 9 days ago, a week and a half ago, people realized that the so-called PPP, the Paycheck Protection Program, is going to run out, or was going to run out of money this week. And in fact, that happened. So there was an intense desire for everyone to refund that. Senator McConnell, the majority leader, the Republican in the Senate, went to the floor last week and said, I'm proposing we put $250 billion in PPP and nothing else, take it or leave it. I'm not even going to negotiate. I'm not going to talk.
Yeah.
Well, that wasn't a very productive way to try to solve a problem, because there are other serious problems, one of which we've been talking about, which is testing. That's critical if we want to reopen the economy. And then there's a huge demand in hospitals. We have some hospitals that are really at risk, and our rural hospitals in
Mm.
particular. So Chuck Schumer, the Democratic leader in the House, has been working on more money for hospitals, more money for testing, and some set-asides within this paycheck protection program for really smaller businesses. A lot of fairly large businesses got a lot of money in the first round, and they wanted to be sure that smaller businesses who didn't necessarily have bank relationships and were women-owned, minority-owned, would have a shot at getting some of the next round of this funding. So that's what the discussions have been about over the last few days. There have been a lot of conversations. I haven't been directly involved in the negotiations, but I've been following them, and I've had conference calls with Senator Schumer. And as near as I can tell, they're very close to a resolution, but they've been saying that for 24 hours. So I'm hoping that by tonight, they're going to be able to find a resolution, get that interim package through tomorrow by unanimous consent in the Senate, and then I think Thursday in the House.
Mm-hmm.
And we'll be back trying to support the economy and help us get through this.
Tell us more about how you've been working with the governor's office, and what's been what's been the relationship and the issues that you've been dealing with, both with the governor's office as well as with the federal response.
Well, I've known the governor for 30 years, and we're in touch literally daily. I just forwarded her today, in fact, two really good pieces that I ran across about what are the elements you should think about when you're reopening the economy, based upon the experience in places like South Korea and Italy and Singapore and other places that have, sort of been ahead of us in this. So we go back and forth. We usually talk once every other day or so, and a lot of texting and emailing. But I'm a former governor myself, as you know, and this is a really hard decision that she's going to have to make, because we don't want to lose the summer. We don't want to close our economy down. We know how devastating it is, but on the other hand, we don't want to doom ourselves to a longer shutdown, a more severe shutdown, not to mention putting people's lives at risk.
Right. So the Goldfarb Center for Public Affairs at Colby, the students have had a theme this year. It's been on racial wealth inequality. And if we were back on campus last week, we were going to have a big symposium where students were going to present policy ideas about this. The coronavirus has certainly magnified these issues. And I'm curious what policies that you've seen that you think will be helpful to address this discrimination and the growing wealth gap that we see in America.
Well, the growing wealth gap is a huge subject, and we could spend the rest of the evening just talking about that. But I think the coronavirus has certainly brought into stark relief the effects of the gaps that we have in our society. I know in cities where there's a significant African American population, I think I can't remember, something like in one city there was a 20% African American population, but 65 or 70% of the coronavirus deaths were among African Americans because of a complex series of things: lack of access to health care, lack of they're not. Many of those folks who are doing work out in the society can't exactly work from home. So they're more exposed to the disease. And that's the kind of thing, in fact, that's part of what this negotiation has been about in the last few days, was a more equitable distribution of this small business aid so that it does flow into the minority community who may not have the relationship. See, the PPP program was designed to run through banks. And so if you have a small, a barber shop or a small business, and there are a lot of people in America, the term is they're not banked. They don't have a relationship with a bank, and therefore they weren't able to access this money. Now we're trying to work through that to be sure that there are some set-asides to be sure that the money is fairly distributed. The larger question of income inequality is a very serious one, and I think it's one that we're going to have to address. I don't want to see America become a country of gated communities and a few people very wealthy and everybody else struggling.
Right. Yeah, neither of us do, right? I want to turn now to the students. We have two leader students, Josh Browse and Hallie Carroll, and both of them are freshmen. They've been paying attention to any comments or questions that have come through. Josh, I'm going to turn it over to you. He's not going to come onto the screen. But Josh, do you have any question that you want to ask Senator King? While he's typing that in, I want to let you know, Senator, that Josh actually initiated and moderated himself a COVID-19 panel at Colby over 2 months ago. So this is an issue that he's been thinking about for quite some time.
I wish he'd been at the White House 2 months ago.
I'm sure he did too. I'm going to see if I have a little question button. Nope, that's something else. So we'll see what as he comes up. And then Hallie too is a freshman, and she'll be writing in a question as well. While we're waiting for them to do that, oh, it looks like here it is. How do you feel about the president shifting responsibility to governors regarding when to open their states? Thanks, Josh.
I think that's a great question, and that's the question that's been much discussed. You know, as of last Monday, a week ago today, the president said he had all the power. He had total authority to decide when to open the states. In about 24 hours, I think a lot of people got to him on that and explained that that really wasn't true. Under our Constitution, that this is a decision that rests with the governors. I think he also may have realized if he was going to be making that decision, he would be responsible for it. He would own it. So all of a sudden, there was a 180-degree pivot on Wednesday, and it became the governor's responsibility. I think it is the governor's responsibility, and I think that makes sense because they're the closest to their state. They know their state. They know the regions in their state. But, and I know I've said this before, it's not fair to hand this responsibility to the governors and not give them the tools that they need that only the federal government can really mobilize in the way of testing and tracking and those kinds of things. It's not fair to give the governors that responsibility and then step back and say, it's none of my responsibility. That's just not true. And that's what I lost it on a phone call with Vice President Pence last week, because I heard him, talk about, we're doing great testing and everything, but we just couldn't get any really good answers about how much testing are you actually doing? What's the ramp up? What's your goal? We couldn't even get him to tell us what the goal is. I mean, if you don't have a goal, you're never going to get there. And the goal, we ought to be able to put a marker down and say, okay, it's going to be 750,000 tests a day, or 1 million tests a day. And then we can measure whether we're achieving that. But the basic answer to Josh's question is, yes, I think it is the responsibility of the governors, but they've got to be doing it in partnership and with the active support of the federal government as well.
Thank you so much, Senator King. We're going to turn now to Hallie. She's going to type in a question that she has, either one that she saw or heard during our live session or one that she has. Hallie, go ahead. And I see at some point we've had up to 76 people involved in this live session tonight. So that's great. Thanks for helping us kick this off.
That's great. I'm glad to do it. And I've often thought, where would we be if this were 30 years ago or so, and we didn't have all this technology, people couldn't work from home? The impact on the economy would be double or triple what it is today. Okay, here's Holly's question. What are your thoughts on people violating social distancing in order to protest for a reopening of states and the economy this past week? Well, we live in a country that has the First Amendment. We have free speech. We have freedom of expression. We have the First Amendment talks about the right of the people to peaceably assemble and petition their government for redress of grievances. How's that for memorizing the First Amendment? And therefore, these folks have a right to do it. Now, they're taking a risk. They're putting themselves at risk, and they're also putting other people at risk. That's the danger here, that the people can be carrying this virus that don't even know they have it. They may not have symptoms. They may not, it's not like they know what they're doing and then they go out. So that's the danger. I think people, the principle of the First Amendment is that you have free speech, but the old story is you don't have the right to yell fire in a crowded theater. In other words, if your exercise of your free speech is going to endanger people, then you have to really think hard about that. And I respect the right of people to protest. I respect the right of people to be frustrated. I'm frustrated, but I'm able to work from home. So you know, those who can and who are seeing their life savings disappear, I fully understand that. But I think they do need to think about the fact that they're putting themselves and their kids and their parents in danger if they go out. I mean, I've basically only been out for a walk and you know, to pick up a sandwich where it's handed to me at the curbside in about a month. I'm because I just think that's my responsibility as a citizen in this situation.
Mm-hmm. Senator King, thank you so much for your time. We're gonna wrap up here, but I want to give you one last chance to see if you have any other final questions, or not questions for yourself, if you have any other final comments or things that you want to hear, whether it's for, you know, our Colby students or just the broader Maine community.
Well, first I want to just say how sorry I am for the Colby seniors who are not going to have the traditional graduation. Hopefully there'll be some celebration. There'll be something that can be done later, but I think it's hard. And, you know, all of those who had expectations for the spring term of their senior year, I think that's tough. The main thing I want to say, however, is to the just an incredibly profound thank you to the people who are keeping us going.
Yeah.
To nurses, doctors, but also people that work for the post office and delivery people and people that are working in food stores and are getting the food to the food stores. I mean, that whole chain of people that is enabling us to continue with our day-to-day lives. I mean, that when you sign up, you know, to be a doctor or a nurse, you don't necessarily expect that you're going to be putting your life on the line, but that's exactly what they're doing, and they're doing it willingly and generously. And so I think that's the most important thing I want to emphasize right now. And if you see a nurse in scrubs on the way home, give them a wave and say thanks, because they're in the front lines of this. And I guess the final thing is we will make it through it. I hope it's going to be sooner rather than later. And the most ironic thing is we're going to make it through it together, but from 6 feet apart.
Well said. Thank you, Senator King, for joining us. Thank you to all of those that were kind and patient as the senator and I did this for the first time. And please join us for the rest of our series. We will have Senator Susan Collins on Wednesday at 7 p.m. Good night, Senator. Have a great one.
Good night. Nice to be with you.
Thank you.
Live long and prosper.
There you go. Good night, everybody.